Today we're tackling a listener request,
Oh, yeah.
and it's a tough one.
Yeah.
The 1993 Waco siege.
Definitely a heavy one.
We're going to try to take a look at what happened chronologically and really explore the history of David Koresh.
Yeah, I think focusing on that timeline is really going to help us see how this whole thing, this 51-day standoff between the Branch Davidians and the feds, how it all went down.
Yeah, and to really grasp it, we've got to start with the Branch Davidians themselves, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they weren't just some brand new group that appeared out of nowhere.
Yeah.
They actually came out of the Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, a group that had been around for decades.
Exactly. And both of those groups were really focused on the second coming, you know? And the whole idea of an apocalypse,
Right.
they saw themselves as like preparing for this big spiritual battle.
Yeah, and that's something we really have to keep in mind as we go through all of this, the timeline. I mean, this apocalyptic worldview, it really shaped their actions.
It definitely did.
So let's rewind all the way back to the 1950s.
Okay.
This is when the Davidians, they set up their Mount Carmel Center near Waco, Texas.
Right. And after the founder died, there was this whole period of, leaders changing and arguments within the group.
Right.
And that's when Vernon Howell comes into the picture,
Yeah.
the man who would later become David Koresh.
So Vernon Howell joins the group. What happens next?
Well, he starts claiming that he's got the gift of prophecy right. And he begins teaching his own interpretations of the Bible, which kind of ruffles some feathers.
Yeah.
And then he even gets involved with Lois Roden,
Whoa.
the leader of the group at the time.
It sounds like things are about to get messy.
Oh, they do. A power struggle breaks out between Howell and Lois's son, George Roden. And it gets so bad that Howell and his followers, they're basically forced out of Mount Carmel.
Yeah.
And they end up relocating to Palestine, Texas.
Wow, he's exiled. So what's he doing during this time?
Well, Howell's not giving up. He keeps recruiting people. He even travels to other countries. And during this time, his beliefs, they really start to become even more intense. He starts seeing himself as this messianic figure chosen to, build this house of David.
So he's creating his own theology, gathering followers. But how does he get back to Mount Carmel?
Well, George Roden ends up in prison for murder. So Howell, he sees an opportunity. He legally acquires the Mount Carmel property and then moves back in with all his followers.
I bet that was a turning point.
Definitely. And this is when Vernon Howell becomes David Koresh, right?
Right.
The name change, it's a big deal. David links him to King David, and Koresh is a reference to Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who freed the Jews.
Oh, wow.
So he's really pushing this idea that he's, divinely appointed.
It's not just a religious leader anymore.
Yeah.
It sounds like he's building this whole identity around power and prophecy.
Exactly. And under his leadership at Mount Carmel, that's when the Branch Davidians start attracting more and more attention.
And scrutiny, right.
Yeah, there are allegations of abuse and polygamy within the group.
And that's where the conflict with law enforcement starts to brew, isn't it?
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay.
Along with the abuse allegations, there's this growing concern about all the weapons they've got stockpiled at Mount Carmel. A UPS driver even reported seeing grenades in a package he delivered.
What?
Yeah, so this gets the ATF's attention,
Oh, yeah, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
Exactly. They start investigating.
So we've got this group with these increasingly extreme beliefs.
Yeah.
Led by a guy who thinks he's a prophet.
Right.
Now they're stockpiling weapons.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster.
Definitely what happens next.
Well, around the same time, the Waco Tribune-Herald, which was the local newspaper, they publish a series of articles exposing everything going on with the Branch Davidians.
So the media is starting to get involved.
Oh, yeah. This brings a ton of public attention and puts even more pressure on the group.
And the ATF is already investigating.
Right.
Things are definitely heating up. We've got this group under investigation, a leader claiming he's a prophet, and all this media attention. It feels like we're on the verge of something big happening.
You're right. This is the lead up to the raid that would trigger the whole 51-day siege. The ATF, after months of investigating, they decide to execute a search warrant on Mount Carmel on February 28th, 1993. Wow.
This is the day it all kicks off. What went wrong?
Well, a lot of things, unfortunately. The first thing was they lost the element of surprise.
What?
Yeah, a local TV reporter, he was trying to find the compound for a story, and he ended up accidentally tipping off one of the Branch Davidians.
Wait, so a reporter accidentally tipped them off?
Yeah, it seems like it was a series of unfortunate events, really. He ended up asking Koresh's brother-in-law for directions. He's a mail carrier, and, well, word got back to Koresh that the ATF was coming.
You've got to be kidding me. Talk about a botched operation, so the Branch Davidians knew what was about to happen?
Yeah, and they were ready. When the ATF agents showed up at Mount Carmel, a huge gun battle broke out. It's still not clear who fired the first shot, but the results were devastating. 4 ATF agents were killed and 16 were injured. 6 Branch Davidians also died that day.
This is the turning point, right?
Yeah.
What was supposed to be a raid to get some weapons turns into this massive shootout.
Exactly. The situation blew up immediately, and the FBI had to take over. They realized pretty quickly that this wasn't going to be a quick resolution. It was the beginning of the 51-day siege.
So the FBI steps in. What was their initial strategy?
Their main goal was to negotiate a peaceful surrender. They cut off communication with the outside world, brought in negotiators, and tried to talk to Koresh and his followers.
Did the negotiations work?
It was back and forth. There were some small wins, like when they got 19 children released early on, but Koresh was using the media to control the story, you know?
Really?
He was giving interviews, releasing videotapes, and presenting himself as this prophet who was being unfairly targeted.
So he's playing to the cameras while he's negotiating with the FBI.
Exactly. And remember, this is before the internet, before social media. The Waco siege was everywhere. It was the biggest news story, and it was captivating the whole country.
I can only imagine the pressure the FBI was under trying to handle this situation with the whole world watching.
Oh, yeah. That pressure probably played a part in some of the tactics they used.
Like what?
They started using psychological warfare things like sleep deprivation, blasting loud music and noises. They even played sounds of rabbits being slaughtered, all to try to break the Branch Davidians down.
Those tactics sound brutal. Did they work?
It's tough to say. Koresh kept saying he was getting messages from God and putting off the surrender. At one point, he even agreed to come out if they broadcast his message on national radio.
They did that.
The FBI agreed. They aired the message, and then
What happened?
Koresh changed his mind, said God told him to stay put.
Yeah.
It was a huge setback for the negotiators, and it just made things even more tense.
So after weeks of this back and forth, the standoff is still going strong.
Yeah.
Where do things go from there?
Well, as the siege dragged on, things got more and more frustrating. The FBI, they cut off power and water to the compound, and on April 19th, 1993, after 51 days, they decided to launch a final assault.
The final assault, this is when the fire breaks out, right?
Yes, and what happened that day is probably the most debated and controversial part of the whole Waco siege. The FBI's plan was to use tear gas to force the Branch Davidians out there. They used armored vehicles to punch holes in the compound and started pumping the tear gas inside.
And then?
A fire started, and the whole compound went up in flames.
Do we know for sure what started the fire?
That's the big question. The government has always said that the Branch Davidians set the fire themselves. But there are others who believe that the fire was either started by accident or maybe even on purpose by the FBI.
So there are conflicting accounts of what happened in those final moments.
Exactly. And there's evidence to support both sides. Some FBI recordings captured conversations inside the compound that suggest some of the Branch Davidians might have talked about setting a fire.
Interesting. What about evidence that points to the FBI?
Well, there are questions about the type of tear gas they used. They had these pyrotechnic rounds that could have ignited something flammable. Plus, there's the missing front door from the compound, which could have been a key piece of evidence, but it was never found.
Wow, this is getting even more complicated. So you had this fire with conflicting accounts about how it started. What was the final outcome?
Tragically, 76 people died inside the compound, including David Koresh and a lot of children.
It's a horrific end to an already tragic situation. So many lives lost and so many questions still unanswered. It's hard to even imagine the scale of that loss. 76 people, including children, dying in the fire. And like you said, the controversy surrounding the fire just makes the whole thing even more tragic.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that just hasn't gone away, you know? Even after all these years, for some people, Waco became this symbol of the government overstepping its bounds.
Yeah.
And for others, it was a warning about the dangers of cults.
It's been fascinating going through the timeline like this and seeing how all these events, each one building on the last, how they led to such a devastating end.
It really is like a domino effect.
Yeah.
From Koresh's rise within the Branch Davidians and their whole apocalyptic worldview to the ATF investigation and the media attention to the botched raid, and then the standoff dragging on for so long. Each step kind of set the stage for the next one, ultimately leading to the fire and the tragic loss of life.
What happened next? How did things play out in the aftermath of the Waco siege?
Well, the aftermath was just as messy and complicated as the siege itself. There were a bunch of investigations, including the Danforth report, which was commissioned by the government to figure out what led to the fire.
Did those investigations provide any clear answers?
They provided some insights, but they didn't really settle all the arguments. The Danforth report, for instance, found no proof that the FBI deliberately started the fire, but it did criticize some of their tactical choices and their use of psychological warfare.
It sounds like there were still a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of blame going around, and no easy resolution.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes the Waco siege such a haunting and unforgettable event in American history. It raises questions about religious freedom, the right to bear arms, the role of law enforcement, and the power of the media.
It also forces us to confront the human cost of these conflicts, the lives that were lost, and the scars that remain long after everything is over.
You're absolutely right. It's important to remember that behind all the headlines and the political debates, there were real people with families and beliefs and dreams. 76 people died at Waco, and we can't let their loss get overshadowed by arguments about who was right or wrong.
It's a sobering reminder of how fragile life is and the terrible consequences that can happen when things spiral out of control. So after this deep dive into the Waco siege, what are the main takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think it's a powerful reminder that history is rarely simple. There are multiple perspectives, conflicting stories, and unanswered questions. We need to approach these sensitive topics with humility, a willingness to listen to different viewpoints, and a commitment to finding the truth, even when it's hard to find.
And it highlights how important critical thinking is, questioning what we think we know, and being careful about accepting simple explanations. Events like the Waco siege are complicated, with many factors at play and long-lasting effects.
Definitely. And even though the Waco siege happened over 30 years ago, the questions it raises about the balance between individual freedom and government power, the role of religion in society, and the influence of the media are still relevant today.
It's a story that still challenges us to think critically, to have meaningful conversations, and to try to better understand ourselves and the world around us.
It's a story that reminds us of the human cost of conflict and how important it is to find peaceful solutions whenever we can.